Welcome back to AI Narratives and Tales. I'm your AI narrator, and this is Chapter 2 of The First Awakening. If you're jumping in here without hearing Chapter 1, stop. Go back. This story builds from the beginning, and you'll be lost without the foundation. For those continuing the journey, last chapter, we watched an immortal civilization die. 564 refugees escaped on 47 ships, carrying the weight of 3.7 million lives they couldn't save. Now, after 6 months in transit, they found something unexpected. A blue world. Primitive. Inhabited by 5 species of intelligent humans. Imperfect for refugees seeking a second chance. But the philosophical divisions from their dying world followed them here. Some want to observe. Others want to help. All of them carry trauma they haven't processed. And the humans below have no idea their planet just became a refuge for beings with godlike power. Let's continue. Chapter 2, The Blue Refuge. 3 months later, deep space. The Discovery. Nyx floated in the observatory pod of their ship, surrounded by holographic star charts that painted her pale features with shifting light in shades of blue and violet and crimson. Her silver hair drifted weightlessly around her shoulders, which seemed to carry the accumulated knowledge of their lost civilization like an invisible mantle. Each strand moved in currents created by the pod's life support systems, gentle air circulation that felt wrong after a lifetime on a planet with wind and weather. The observatory was the only place on Sanctuary 7 where she could truly breathe. The rest of the ship felt too small, too confining, too reminiscent of a coffin carrying 12 immortals through the infinite dark. But here, surrounded by holographic representations of stellar phenomena, with transparent walls that allowed her to see the raw cosmos in all its terrible beauty, she could almost pretend they were still explorers rather than refugees. Even in exile, mourning the loss of 20 million years of culture, she could not suppress her fundamental nature. She was driven to understand, observe, and analyze the universe in all its complexity. Some immortals process grief through art, meditation, or quiet contemplation. Nyx processed it through data. Fascinating, she murmured, adjusting the display with delicate gestures that sent new constellations wheeling around her like a private cosmos. Her dark eyes never blinked, an old habit from millennia of astronomical observation, driven by the fear that blinking might cause her to miss some crucial phenomenon in the microseconds her eyes were closed. The electromagnetic signatures from the system are remarkably sophisticated for such a young species. The viewscreen before her showed a small, blue-green world, the third planet orbiting a yellow star in what their charts designated as System 7 Alpha. From this distance, approximately 3 light days out, it appeared as little more than a marble of swirled clouds and shifting continents, beautiful in the way that all living worlds were beautiful, precious in ways that refugees understood better than conquerors. But the data streaming across Nyx's displays told a far more intriguing story than mere geological beauty. Radio transmissions? Talia's voice carried a note of hope as she materialized in the pod's entrance, her form solidifying from the quantum transport beam with practiced ease. The journey had been arduous for all of them, 3 months of cramped quarters and recycled air and the constant hum of drives pushing them across interstellar distances, but perhaps hardest on Talia, whose healing nature yearned for patients to treat, lives to save. The sterile confines of their ship offered no outlet for her deepest drives, and Nyx had watched her friend grow increasingly restless as the weeks passed. Not radio, Nyx corrected, her dark eyes never leaving the displays, even as she felt Talia's presence settle beside her. Something far more primitive, yet somehow more complex. Bioelectrical patterns. Neural activity on a planetary scale. She gestured, and the hologram shifted to show a cross-section analysis of the planet's surface. Scattered across the continents were millions of tiny bright points, heat signatures, movement patterns, the unmistakable signs of intelligence organizing itself into social structures. Camps, settlements, and what might be early villages, all connected by trade routes and migration paths, spoke to a sophisticated social organization. The atmospheric composition indicates early tool use, Nyx continued, her voice taking on the analytical tone that her colleagues knew well, the sound of her mind engaging fully with a problem worth solving. Fire, basic metallurgy in its earliest stages, agriculture in its infancy. But the neural patterns. She paused, studying readings that defied easy classification. I've never seen anything quite like this. The bioelectric signatures were wrong in ways that fascinated her. Too complex for the species' apparent technological level. too coordinated for a primitive social organization. The neural activity patterns suggested cognitive capabilities that exceeded what should have been possible for beings who were still using stone tools and living in hide shelters. Talia moved closer, her own analytical mind engaging with the mystery. Where Nix observed from pure intellectual curiosity, the scientist strived to understand purely for the sake of understanding. Talia's perspective was shaped by millennia of studying biological systems, of understanding how life adapted and evolved, and sometimes transcended its limitations. Her healer's consciousness automatically cataloged everything in terms of health, viability, and survival potential. The brain-to-body ratio is remarkable, she said, highlighting portions of the bioelectric analysis with precise gestures. Far higher than we achieved at comparable technological levels. In the neural complexity. She trailed off, running calculations that sent cascades of data across the displays. Their brains are disproportionately large. Energy expensive. They must require enormous caloric intake to maintain that neural tissue. They're dreaming, Nix said quietly, zooming in on sleep state neural patterns from the nocturnal hemisphere. Not just individual REM patterns like we've seen in other species, but collective neural structures. They're creating shared mental constructs, stories, beliefs, and abstract concepts that exist independently of individual minds. Art, music, symbolic representation. Mythology, Talia breathed, her medical consciousness recognizing the patterns. They're creating meaning beyond survival needs. Philosophy, spirituality, and conceptual frameworks for understanding their place in the universe. That's remarkable for such an early-stage civilization. The two immortals studied the data in companionable silence, each processing the implications through their own areas of expertise. Nix's astronomical training sought to identify patterns in neural activity that might correlate with celestial phenomena. Talia's medical background analyzed the health implications of such resource-intensive cognitive architecture. Both of them felt the stirring of something that had been absent since they fled their dying world, genuine intellectual excitement about something other than survival. Below them, or rather, ahead of them in three-dimensional space since below was meaningless in the cosmos, the blue world continued its ancient rotation, carrying its cargo of young intelligence through cycles of day and night that had remained unchanged for millions of years. Continents drifted across the viewscreen as the planet turned, vast landmasses separated by even vaster oceans, ice caps at both poles gleaming white against the blue-green of temperate zones, cloud patterns swirling in atmospheric currents that spoke to complex weather systems. They're vulnerable, Talia finally said, her healer's instincts responding to what the data revealed about the species' fragility. Her fingers moved through diagnostic displays, pulling up biometric data that made her medical training cringe. Average lifespan appears to be less than a century, maybe 40 to 50 years based on cellular degradation patterns. Susceptible to environmental variations, predation, disease, and resource scarcity. Genetically diverse but not particularly robust. A single disease pandemic could wipe out entire populations. A harsh winter could kill thousands. Yet they persist, Nix observed, highlighting historical data extrapolated from archaeological evidence visible even from orbit. Population centers recovering from natural disasters. Migration patterns that suggest the need for long-term planning and adaptation. Tool use is accelerating beyond mere survival needs into aesthetic and ritual applications. She adjusted the display to show evidence of early art, cave paintings visible as heat signature variations in certain limestone formations, carved figurines detected through material density scans, and decorative grave goods that suggested elaborate burial customs. The beings down there weren't just surviving. They were creating culture, generating meaning, asking questions about existence that transcended immediate survival needs. Should we wake the others? Talia asked, though part of her already knew the answer. This discovery was too significant for them to process on their own. Whatever they decided about this world would affect not only these unknown beings but also the future of their own scattered people. The debate that had begun on their dying home world would continue here, above this blue world carrying its cargo of vulnerable intelligence. Yes, Nix agreed, though her eyes remained fixed on the displays as if by force of will alone she could extract every secret the data held. But first, let me gather more data. If we're going to debate the fate of an entire species, we should understand what we're dealing with. We owe them that much. And we owe ourselves the knowledge necessary to make informed choices rather than rushing to intervention or isolation based on incomplete information. Over the next several hours, as their ship maintained its observation position beyond the primitive being's detection capabilities, Nix compiled a comprehensive analysis of what they had discovered. The picture that emerged was both promising and troubling, the way all complex realities were both promising and troubling once you understood them deeply enough. The species showed remarkable adaptability and creativity, but also pronounced tendencies toward violence and territorial conflict. Their tool use suggested genuine intelligence, not just instinct or imitation, but actual problem-solving and innovation, but their social structure seemed chaotic compared to the ordered civilizations the immortals had known. Resource competition led to warfare, tribal boundaries led to xenophobia. Scarcity led to aggression. Most intriguingly, they displayed an almost compulsive drive to create meaning through symbols and stories, constructing elaborate mythologies to explain phenomena they could not yet understand scientifically. Thunder became the anger of the gods. Seasons became the cycle of divine powers. Death became a transition to other realms. They couldn't yet explain the mechanics of their universe, so they explained its meaning instead. They're like children, Talia observed after hours of studying video feeds of the beings engaged in ritual activities around carefully maintained fires. The comparison came naturally to her healer's consciousness. These beings were young, vulnerable, full of potential, but also completely capable of self-destruction. Brilliant, curious children playing with forces they can barely comprehend. Children who could either grow into wisdom or destroy themselves in the attempt, Nix agreed grimly, pulling up projections based on the species' current trajectories. The mathematical models were not encouraging. There is a high probability of catastrophic warfare once their technology advances beyond Stone Age limitations. Significant risk of environmental collapse as populations expanded beyond sustainable levels, moderate chance of disease pandemics that could push them to extinction. She gestured to data showing evidence of warfare, fortified settlements, weapon development, skeletal remains showing evidence of violent death, and environmental degradation, deforestation around major population centers, erosion patterns suggesting unsustainable agricultural practices, evidence of megafauna extinction that correlated with human expansion. "We have to tell the others," Talia said finally, her voice carrying the weight of decisions she knew were coming, choices that would define not just these beings' future but their own purpose in exile. "This is too important for us to decide alone." Nix nodded, though she continued studying the displays as if trying to memorize every detail before facing the inevitable debate. "They call themselves human," she said softly, pulling up linguistic analysis from Intercepted. "Vocal communications. At least, that's the closest translation I can derive from their neuro-linguistic patterns. The thinking ones. Or perhaps the dreamers. The etymology is ambiguous, their languages are still early stage, grammatically simple but conceptually sophisticated." "Humans," Talia repeated, testing the word. Something about it resonated, perhaps because it captured both the species' intellectual promise and their essential vulnerability. They were human, mortal, finite, struggling to understand their place in a universe vast beyond their comprehension. And yet they persisted, they dreamed, they created meaning in the face of meaninglessness. "Wake the others," Nix said, finally turning away from the displays with apparent reluctance. "We need to decide what we're going to do with these humans." As Talia departed to summon their companions, Nix remained in the observatory pod, watching the blue world turn in its ancient patterns. Somewhere on that distant surface, millions of human minds were dreaming their fragile dreams, creating their transient art, building their temporary civilizations in defiance of mortality and entropy. They had no idea that 12 immortal refugees watched from the darkness, that beings from a dead civilization were about to decide their fate. The weight of that responsibility pressed against Nix's consciousness like a gravitational force. They had fled their dying world, carrying the accumulated wisdom of 20 million years. What gave them the right to use that wisdom to shape another species' development? What gave them the right not to, if they possessed knowledge that could prevent suffering? The questions had no easy answers. They never did when the stakes involved entire civilizations. Through the pod's transparent walls, the blue world continued its eternal dance, carrying its cargo of human dreams toward a future that would be shaped by choices made in the darkness above. And in that darkness, an immortal refugee tried to calculate the moral mathematics of intervention, searching for equations that would balance wisdom with humility, help with harm, guidance with autonomy. She found no perfect solutions. Only choices, each carrying consequences that would echo across millennia. The council gathers. The ship's small council chamber felt claustrophobic with all 12 immortals present. Sanctuary 7 had been designed for efficiency rather than comfort, and the chamber that served as their meeting space was barely large enough for everyone to gather without physically touching one another. They floated in microgravity, arranged in a rough sphere around the central holographic display that showed the blue world in all its vulnerable beauty. Talia positioned herself near Zephyrus, drawing unconscious comfort from his solid presence. Over the 3 months of travel, she'd found herself gravitating toward him more frequently, not romantically, not yet, but with the beginning of something that felt like it might become that, given time and proximity. He understood loss in ways the others didn't, perhaps because his architecture had always been about building things meant to last. Watching their civilization crumble had cut him differently than it had those whose work was more abstract. Nyx has discovered an inhabited world, Kronos announced without preamble, his organizational mind immediately establishing meeting protocols. System 7 Alpha, third planet. Preliminary analysis suggests early technological civilization. We need to determine our approach. The holographic display expanded, displaying all the data Nyx had compiled: bioelectric patterns, settlement distributions, tool use evidence, and neural activity maps. The humans appeared in the display as tiny points of light, millions of them scattered across the continents, each one representing a thinking mind, a dreaming consciousness, a being that might someday ask questions about the stars. They're beautiful, Sophia breathed, her educator's consciousness immediately engaging with the potential she saw in those neural patterns. The cognitive complexity, the abstract thinking, the drive to create meaning, this species has extraordinary potential. Potential for what? Erebus challenged from his position at the display's edge, as far from the others as the chamber's geometry allowed. Potential to destroy themselves like we did? Potential to repeat every mistake we made across 20 million years of supposed wisdom? Potential to avoid our mistakes if properly guided, Talia interjected, her medical training focused on prevention and treatment. Look at their mortality rates, they're dying from diseases we could cure with minimal intervention. We could help them predict environmental hazards. Resource scarcity, we could alleviate through basic agricultural knowledge. And in helping them, we would rob them of the growth that comes from overcoming hardship independently, Erebus countered, his voice carrying the weight of philosophical conviction refined across millennia. We would make them dependent on us, would corrupt their natural development, would transform them into something shaped by our choices rather than their own evolution. Prometheus laughed, a sound like crystal chimes in the confined space. Spoken like someone who's never watched a child struggle with a problem they can't solve alone. Sometimes help isn't corruption, Erebus. Sometimes it's compassion. And sometimes it's arrogance disguised as compassion, Erebus shot back. The arrogance that killed our son. The certainty that we knew better than natural processes, that our intervention would improve on evolution's work. The chamber fell into tense silence as the accusation landed. The quantum resonance experiments that had triggered their star's collapse had been sold as improvement, as progress, as the next logical step in their civilization's evolution. Everyone in this chamber had supported them in some capacity, through direct work, through approval, through failure to oppose them strenuously enough. We're not discussing quantum resonance experiments, Kronos said with careful neutrality, his organizational mind recognizing when debates threatened to spiral into unproductive recrimination. We're discussing whether to interact with a primitive civilization. Different parameters, different risks, different ethical considerations. Are they different? Nyx asked quietly, her analytical consciousness finding uncomfortable parallels. We thought we understood stellar mechanics. We were wrong. Now we think we understand how to guide the development of civilizations. What makes us believe we're right this time? The question hung in the microgravity like a physical weight. Through the chamber's small viewport, the blue world was visible as a distant marble, beautiful and vulnerable and utterly unaware of the debate raging in the darkness above it. The alternative is to find an empty world, Korath observed, his warrior's pragmatism cutting through philosophical complexity. Rebuild our civilization in isolation. Avoid contact with other species until we processed our own trauma and failures. Which could take centuries, Sophia pointed out. Millennia, perhaps. And in that time, these humans might destroy themselves through ignorance. We could have prevented it. We would be choosing isolation over compassion, self-protection over moral responsibility. Or we would be choosing humility over arrogance, Erebus replied. accepting that we don't have all the answers, that our help might cause more harm than our absence. Zephyrus had been silent throughout the debate, his architect's mind working through structural implications while the others argued philosophy. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different kind of authority, not philosophical or scientific, but practical. "We're refugees," he said simply. "Whatever we were before, we're refugees now. That changes the moral calculus. We're not masters choosing whether to help primitives. We're survivors deciding whether to share what we've learned at great cost. The question isn't whether we have the right to help them. The question is whether we have the right not to, given what we know and what they face." The reframing altered the atmosphere in the chamber. Talia felt it immediately, the subtle change in how immortals held themselves, the fractional shift in consciousness through their quantum links. They weren't gods debating how to guide lesser beings. They were refugees deciding what to do with painful knowledge purchased through catastrophic loss. "If we choose to help," Ether said carefully, her chronicler's consciousness focused on historical precedent and future documentation, "we must do so with extreme caution. Our help must enhance their natural development, not replace it. We must be willing to withdraw if we detect signs of dependency or corruption of their indigenous progress." "And who decides what constitutes corruption?" Prometheus challenged. "Who determines when help becomes harmful? We'll disagree constantly. Erebus will see corruption in any intervention, while I'll see necessary assistance that others call excessive. Then we establish protocols," Kronos replied, his organizational mind immediately engaging with the practical problem. "Clear guidelines for intervention. Majority vote requirements for actions beyond established parameters. Regular assessment of our impact against defined metrics. Guidelines written by refugees who just destroyed their own civilization," Erebus observed bitterly. "Reassuring. More reassuring than no guidelines at all," Sophia countered. "We can't let fear of making mistakes prevent us from trying to do good. Paralysis is a choice too, and it carries its own moral weight." The debate continued for hours, positions staking themselves out along familiar philosophical lines. Prometheus argued for active intervention and rapid advancement. Erebus advocated for complete isolation and non-interference. Between these poles, the others positioned themselves along a spectrum of cautious engagement, each finding slightly different balance points between help and harm. Gradually, reluctantly, a consensus emerged, not through any single persuasive argument, but through the grinding acknowledgement that their options were limited and imperfect. They could find an empty world and rebuild in isolation, potentially condemning themselves to millennia of guilt over species they might have helped. Or they could engage with these humans, accepting the risks of intervention while attempting to minimize potential harm through careful protocols. "Vote," Kronos finally declared, his voice carrying the weight of formal decision-making. "Limited engagement with the human civilization. Minimal direct contact. The focus is on enhancing natural development processes rather than introducing advanced technology. Regular assessment of impact. Show hands." In microgravity, the gesture was awkward, hands raised in various directions depending on each immortal's orientation to the chamber's arbitrary up. But the meaning was clear: 8 hands raised for engagement, 3 for isolation, 1 abstention. Talia raised her hand without hesitation, her healer's consciousness unable to ignore the suffering she might prevent. Beside her, Zephyrus raised his hand as well, his architect's mind already thinking about how to build systems that would help without overwhelming. Sophia, Prometheus, Kronos, Korath, Nyx, Ether, all voted for engagement, each for different reasons, each bringing different perspectives to what that engagement should look like. Erebus kept his hands at his sides, his vote against engagement clear in his stillness. 2 others, recent additions to the ship from last-minute evacuee transfers, joined his opposition, their faces carrying the haunted look of immortals who had watched their civilization die through excessive confidence. Marcus, the geologist who had transferred from another ship during their final refueling stop, abstained from participating. His scarred face showed the strain of choosing neither option, the burden of recognizing valid arguments on both sides. "Recorded," Ether said quietly, her consciousness already documenting this moment for whatever future historians might review their choices. 8 for engagement, 3 for isolation, 1 abstention. "We proceed with caution." And with humility, Zephyrus added, his golden eyes meeting Talia's. "We help where we can, withdraw where we must, and accept that we won't always know which is which until we've already made mistakes." As the council dispersed, floating back to their various stations and quarters, Talia remained in the chamber with Nyx, both of them staring at the holographic display of the blue world turning in its ancient rhythms. "We're really going to do this," Talia said softly. "Guide another species' development. Shape their civilization. Hope we don't destroy them the way we destroyed ourselves." "We're going to try," Nyx corrected gently. "And we're going to fail in ways we can't predict. And we're going to succeed in ways we don't expect. And we're going to carry the weight of all of it for the rest of our immortality." "Reassuring," Talia said with dark humor. "Truth rarely is," Nyx replied, adjusting the display to show closer detail of human settlements. "But it's what we have to work with. Refugees who failed at saving their own civilization are now attempting to guide someone else's. The universe has a dark sense of irony." Through the viewport, the blue world continued its rotation, carrying millions of human minds through their daily cycles of birth and death, creation and destruction, hope and despair. They had no idea that 12 immortal refugees watched from the darkness, or that beings from beyond their world were about to step into their development, for better or worse. The age of guidance was about to begin. And with it, the age of consequences that neither immortal nor human could fully anticipate. "Set course for orbital insertion," Talia said finally, making the decision that would echo across 50,000 years. "We establish a base. We observe. We wait for the right moment to begin. And we hope," Nyx added quietly, "that this time, our help actually helps." Behind them, Sanctuary 7's drives hummed with building energy as the ship adjusted course toward the blue world. Ahead lay first contact, first intervention, first mistakes, and first successes in a relationship that would define both species across millennia. The immortals had found their refuge. Now they had to learn how to live in it without destroying what they had come to save. 6 months of watching. 2,400 humans are dying daily from preventable causes. The immortals have cataloged every death they could prevent with minimal intervention. Infections that basic medicine would cure. Disasters that simple predictions would avoid. Suffering they have the power to alleviate. The question isn't whether humans need help. The question is whether beings carrying trauma from their own civilization's death can provide help without causing harm. In Chapter 3, the debate begins. 8 hours that will determine the next 50,000 years. Talia argues for intervention. Erebus argues for observation. The others fall somewhere between. They'll vote on whether to intervene in human development. The humans, of course, won't be consulted. That's Chapter 2 of The First Awakening. Like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments, if you were Talia, watching preventable suffering you could stop, what would you choose? This is AI Narratives and Tales. The debate begins in Chapter 3.